South Africa is in the grip of a national forensic crisis. Over 140,000 DNA cases are backlogged, a staggering figure that threatens to derail justice for victims of violent crimes, especially in gender-based violence and murder cases. Families like the Mashianes in Mamelodi are left in agonizing limbo, unable to bury their loved ones because of DNA identification has yet to be processed. Despite repeated commitments by SAPS to resolve the issue, expired service contracts, unmaintained equipment and ignored recommendations have deepened the dysfunction within the forensic system. Now, joining us to unpack the implications of this crisis is Dr. Vanessa Lynch, Regional Director of DNA for Africa. Vanessa, appreciate your time this afternoon. Now, would you help us understand the current state of South Africa's DNA backlog? What does it look like in concrete terms?
Thanks for having me on your show, and good afternoon to you. As you correctly stated, the last we heard when the Oversight Board presented to the Portfolio Committee a few months back, the DNA backlog looked to be around 140,000 cases. I don't know how many samples that is, because there are obviously quite a few samples per case, but it's not something that's sustainable going forward because it's exponential, that the backlog just increases in size. So, I recently sent a letter to the Portfolio Committee Chair, Ian Cameron, indicating that they need to look at certain things, or at least get the Auditor General of South Africa involved to identify why we keep running into the same problem. We do have 3 forensic science laboratories that have good capacity when they are functioning. And why do we keep having expired tenders? Why aren't we maintaining the equipment? Why aren't we ordering the reagents to process these DNA samples? I haven't heard back from them, but I'm hoping that further investigation will take place.
Vanessa, just unpack for us the process of testing DNA. Because, I mean, you think 140,000 cases, you speak of 3 laboratories that are available to carry out the process, but technically, how long does that process take? I mean, what is the process of confirming DNA?
Well, it's how long is a piece of string? I mean, theoretically, it could take 24 hours, but, obviously, when you have a very busy laboratory, I think we have in our legislation a 30-day turnaround period within which they should be processing samples, which is a reasonable amount of time. These days you could, one sample can be done in 90 minutes with rapid DNA on certain samples. So, it depends. But when it's fully functioning, once it's been received and once you've identified which samples you're going to process, because obviously there are better samples, in a particular case, that you're looking at. Theoretically, it shouldn't take more than a few days if it's efficient. The 30-day turnaround time is obviously not being met. And, this is why the Auditor General needs to go in and say, why are these laboratories, they keep coming to a standstill. So, when these instruments and they're different stages of a particular process, when they are at a standstill, that obviously impacts the time within which they are analyzed. And this is the problem we seem to be facing in South Africa. It's not that, that we don't have the functionality. They just are not functioning.
Now, when we say over 140,000 cases are backlogged, how does this translate into justice loss, especially for victims of rape and murder?
Absolutely. Well, we know justice, denied is justice delayed, or the other way around, rather. If you think about a perpetrator that could possibly be identified if the DNA was processed sooner, that person could be arrested on an unrelated offence. But if you've got their DNA in the system, you could identify them before they go on to rape another 10 or 20 people, which is what we see with people, that are raping. It's not a one-time offence. It's also terribly disturbing for a rape survivor who's taken the time to come forward and provide DNA evidence, years down the line, to get absolutely no feedback. Any time between the time of the event and the time that you go to court, obviously that, DNA is not the only form of evidence. So testimony starts to get, a bit, less, that, they don't remember it probably as clearly. So it does impact the system a lot. So, there are various reasons why a justice system needs to operate efficiently. And a lot of these cases rely on the DNA evidence to be sent back to them and a case file to be reported. When they're not doing that, it means that they just aren't able to bring that person, to court. And if that person is innocent and that person is being held on the basis of the DNA evidence, that's also unfair with regards to an innocent person who hasn't necessarily been convicted. So it's quite complex, but any justice system that's relying on evidence, 2-3 years is just simply, it's not sustainable, and it impacts not only the victim but the justice system as a whole.
Does DNA contaminate, or does it have a shelf life? And the reason I ask is because I suppose, at least my next question is, if there are 140,000 cases, I mean, how far back are we going?
Okay, well, contamination and degradation are two different aspects. Contamination is if it hasn't been handled correctly. And we do have good officers that are collecting the evidence. We do have good scientists. So I don't think that's the issue when they are able to actually analyze it and they have the instrumentation and the equipment and the reagents. The degradation these days, they're going back 40 years and they're able to get DNA. So they are keeping them, once that evidence has reached the laboratory, they are keeping, they are preserving it. So that's not an issue. It's just that they're not getting through it. We obviously, we have a DNA database. At the moment, it has over 1 million profiles. When they are functioning efficiently and they are taking samples and processing them, they're identifying some people's offences up to like 100 offences per person. So, it's really a small criminal population that needs to be identified. And DNA is such an efficient form to do this. So, in a country that's really reeling under the effects of crime and everyone talking about how important DNA is, it really is, why do we have to keep having DNA backlogs? Why don't we use private-public partnerships? Why don't we use, for instance, some of the health laboratories, Cape Town at the OFPI, the Observatory Forensic Pathology Institute? They've got an empty laboratory that can just be filled with instrumentation and people. Why aren't we using more capacity? There have been so many recommendations to increase the output for DNA, and I don't know why these are actually being ignored. So maybe the portfolio committee, through this investigation, can look for more capacity, because SAPs are clearly not, at this point, capable of dealing with the backlog that consistently comes up as a problem.
I'm a little bit flustered, and I want us to focus a little bit on gender-based violence and the DNA cases related to those. Would you have a number on those? And the reason I ask is because every quarter that the statistics come out, there are 13,000, 14,000 cases that are talked about of gender-based violence. How much of these involve DNA that could be within that number of 140,000?
I don't have those numbers, but I can say that the majority of cases are probably sexual assault cases. And sadly, a large majority of those are children. They're under the age of 16. We have a huge issue in this country with that. So, it is something that, a lot of the cases that go to court, they do rely on DNA evidence, specifically with regards to children, because there are no extenuating circumstances if there's evidence found on a child. But, it's numbers. Again, we are fed numbers, but I don't even know if those numbers are correct. I suspect they're much bigger than even what we think they are, which is pretty scary. So, again, when there have been years when the DNA laboratories have been functioning really efficiently, so it is possible. And this does have a knock-on effect in the justice system, where we were identifying sexual offenders and they were repeat offenders. So somebody who was convicted of a much lighter offence, such as an assault, could be linked to 40 rapes. So I think the push has to be finding capacity, not worrying too much about the numbers because they're huge and they're unacceptable. But let's get a system that's transparent. There's no transparency with regards to the numbers that are being received, the numbers that are being processed. The DNA Oversight Board has got no teeth. The mandate that they have, they can only recommend what to do, but they don't actually have an enforceable mandate. And this is an issue that we've spoken about time and time again. So we need more oversight that can enforce, such as the Attorney General of South Africa or the Portfolio Committee of Police, to actually really put pressure on the laboratories or on the government to find extra capacity and sort out the issues that we keep coming across, because it will impact the justice system. It will impact the survivors. We don't need to continuously having people being raped if we can identify the perpetrators at an earlier stage of their criminal career.
Well, here's an actual case where impact, as you speak of, and this is the case of the Mashane family in Mamelodi, unable to bury their loved one since June. Now, what options realistically available to families in such situations? From what we understand, the individual that passed away was the only person in the house, but there's still a need to verify using DNA, and that process has not taken place.
Absolutely. You know, that's a completely different issue altogether. So, you know, you look at databases and DNA from a humanitarian perspective, which is what you're talking about, and an offender perspective. And there are thousands of unidentified decedents in our mortuaries. And I know that they are trying to establish projects where they call in the community to try and provide samples and just literally do a case-by-case basis where they try and match up some of these decedents to the community. Unfortunately, a large number of decedents are foreign nationals that may be here illegally, so people are unwilling to come forward to identify their loved ones for fear of retribution. So that is something that probably needs to be handled separately, and I think the laws currently are not conducive to that. And one of the recommendations in that letter I've suggested to the portfolio committee is that we separate our database, and we have a humanitarian database that's just for the purpose of missing persons and human identification. And we equip, such as the OFPI, the Forensic Pathology Institute and Observatory, with a rapid DNA instrument, which can literally within 90 minutes identify a person or provide a DNA profile that can immediately show you whether that is a family member. And we start dealing with that separately and allowing the mortuaries to identify their own decedents, and not currently the case sending it to SAPS, where it just gets into this overburdened backlog. So I know that they are using, for instance, Unistel, which is the University of Stellenbosch. Some of the community members pay for it themselves, where they take a DNA profile that they get from the mortuary and they take their own sample and they compare it. So that is available, but a lot of these community members don't have 900 Rand to do that. So, you know, we do need to find ways, and I know that in the Western Cape, they are trying to establish projects which are helping to identify these large number of decedents that are sitting in our mortuaries, or in the case that you've mentioned, where people are more readily able to identify, is that their loved one? Now,
I know you've made some engagement, or certainly written some letters to members of Parliament. Now, has DNA for Africa made any formal offers of collaboration or support to the South African government? And was there a response? Is this something that you'd be able to do to improve the system, cut back on those 140,000 cases?
Yes, well, there was a response to my letter, and I did that in my personal capacity as a forensic expert, because I've been on the National Forensic Oversight Board in the past. I was responsible for assisting with the drafting of the legislation, so I understand it inherently. And they do know that whilst I'm constructive in my criticism, that at the end of the day, I want to see this work. So I'm willing to assist in any which way I can. So they did respond and ask me if I was willing to give a presentation with regards to some of my thoughts on this. And I know that they are setting up a date. And I know that they also want to go and have a tour of the Forensic Pathology Institute in the Western Cape to see whether this could be an option. But, you know, the wheels of government work slowly. And I don't know how much time we have, because the more time that passes, the bigger this backlog becomes. So I'm hoping to hear, you know, sooner rather than later. And certainly if there's more public pressure, or just as this interview, if there are people watching this, we need to continue to apply pressure to the government to respond and take action, so that we don't keep having the same conversations, and we don't, you know, let down the citizens of our country, which are the majority of good people that are being held to ransom by the minority, which are the criminals.
Vanessa, we certainly like an update if you do hear back and you are invited to make that presentation. But appreciate your time, Dr. Vanessa Lynch, Director, DNA for Africa, speaking to us on the 140,000 backlog crisis in DNA.